Hello, everybody. It's Monday from our studios in fancy schmancy Southern California. This is RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's show, we're going to talk about how to set up your training. You know, runners get so caught up in the daily runs and the workouts that they have to do, but it's important to think about, well, how do you set up your training? What is the best method of setting up the training to get the results that you want? So on today's show is all going to be about planning the training. I could talk for many hours about this, but we'll try to just give a brief talk today about how to structure the training. And so depending on what race you're training for, I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into, well, where do I begin? You know, people always ask me, where do I begin? There's a lot of factors to think about. You know, where do you begin to plan the training? You have to consider things like your strengths and weaknesses as a runner. You have to think about the type of race that you're training for. You know, you're training for a mile, you're training for a 5K, you're training for a marathon. You have to think about those things. You have to think about your schedule, you know, your work schedule. We tend to think of things in terms of 7 days in a week, even though the training doesn't have to be set up that way, nor maybe should it be set up that way. But most people arrange their lives in a 7-day week. And so you have to consider your schedule, your work schedule, your family schedule, when you can squeeze things in. So there's a lot of things to consider when planning a training program. But those kinds of scheduling things aside, let's talk about, you know, what kinds of things go into the planning of the training. So first you have to think on a macro level. You got to think on a big level. You know, what is the end goal? Always work from the end in mind. You know, if you ever read Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of the habits is always begin with the end in mind. And so that also applies to the training plan. You have to begin with the end in mind. What is the overall goal of the training? You know, what do you want to accomplish? What race you're training for, when the race is, and what do you want to accomplish in that race and in other races that you're going to run in the lead up to the big race. So always start with the end in mind and think on a macro level. Then once you think on a large macro level, then we start to break it down into smaller and smaller segments. And this is where the term, if you're already thinking, when I said macro, if you're already thinking about macro cycle, you know, these terms, macro cycle and Meso Cycle and microcycle, came from the former Soviet Union when they came up with the theories of training design, training program design. And so we have the Russians to thank for that. I know Russia gets a bad rap. But when it comes to training theories and training program design, the Russians were way ahead of everybody else in the world. And so this all goes back to the terminology that they use. You know, thinking of looking at a macro cycle, which is, it could be a whole year of training as one macro cycle, or a longer period of training. And then we get into mesocycles, which are a medium phase of training, a medium length duration of training. And there's multiple mesocycles that fit within each macro. So if a macro cycle is a year, you think of the big term picture, and then we take that big term picture and we break it up into a smaller segment. And the next smallest segment is the mesocycle. And that usually lasts about 3 to 4 months. Because you can't think of the whole, the way this is designed is that you can't think of the whole year in one section. I mean, how do you train for a whole year? You have to break it down into smaller segments. And so whatever the target race is, we work backwards from that. And so we first think of the whole year. And then once we have that whole blueprint, the whole mapped out thing, then we break it down to smaller segments. And so we break it down into mesocycles, which are about 3 to 4 months long. And then from those mesocycles, we break that down into smaller segments, a microcycle, a small unit. That could be, typically it's a week, because people think in terms of a week, but it could be longer or even shorter than that. And so the way to design the training is to work backwards from the big goal, whatever the big goal race is. And then you ask yourself, well, what kind of training do I need to do 4 weeks from that date? What kind of training do I need to be doing 8 weeks from that date, 12 weeks from that date, and so forth? And that's how you build the training schedule. If you always train forward, if you think of the training schedule from your starting point and moving forward, then you might run into problems, because how do you know that you're going to be able to fit in all of the training components that you need to fit in before the big day, before the big race, the big goal race that you're training for. And so you have to think backwards from the date of the goal race. And so, I talk a lot about this. I have a new book coming out next year on training theories and program design, because, a lot of people think that, well, it all starts with the aerobic work. And for the most part, that's true. But there are exceptions to that based on your training history, your strengths and weaknesses. It doesn't always have to start with slow, easy running, although that is the traditional way of doing things. But part of my goal with these episodes of RUNTALK, I think this is our 25th episode now, part of my goal here is to get people to think outside the box, or outside of the proverbial running shoe. There are other ways to train to get to where you want to go. And a lot of that gets back into what your training history is, what your strengths and weaknesses are as a runner. But for the most part, depending on what your goal is, if you have a significant training history behind you, then you start with building the mileage. And the reasons for that are numerous. We don't have time to go into it today. But there's a lot of underlying physiological variables that you need to train first before you train the speed. Having said that, like I said before, sometimes you got to think outside the box. And if you don't have a history of training behind you, it can be helpful to train the speed first, and really create yourself a speed reserve. A lot of runners, they get into this, training long and slow all the time, and they never train gears. They never move to another gear. They only have one gear, and that gear is slow. And so it's helpful to when you take someone, or you yourself, who has never run before, it's helpful to at least train multiple gears first, so that later, when you really start to focus on the goal race, you have a speed reserve there, and you can move from one gear to the next. Think of like a bicycle. A bicycle that only has one gear is much more difficult to ride than a bicycle that has 10 different gears. And so you can think of that with your own training, is that you need to develop gears. It's very important to develop gears and train with a whole continuum of speeds, from very, very slow to very, very fast. And so let's get back to the training program design. So you start from the end in mind, and you work backwards. And so if the most intense training is going to happen immediately prior to the race, then that sets up what happens in the few weeks leading up to the race. You plan a taper. If you're training for a longer race that requires a longer taper, you can plan for that by working backwards. And then prior to the taper, you can plan, well, what's the work that I need to be doing? And then prior to that, you can plan. So it makes it a lot easier to train with the end in mind and work backwards. And so that's how you would build the program, is you set up each phase of training, or each mesocycle. If a mesocycle is, a mesocycle could be anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks long, depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish in the mesocycle. Understanding that certain characteristics are quicker to train than other characteristics. It takes longer to develop endurance, and the physiological variables associated with aerobic metabolism, that takes longer to develop than anaerobic metabolism and speed. So you don't need to spend as long developing speed as developing aerobic endurance. So those kinds of things play a role in how long you set up each mesocycle for. And so, like I said earlier, a macrocycle could be a whole year, or it could be just a longer chunk of training. You could think of a macrocycle as a season of training if you want, and just have it be like a 6-month block. That could be your macrocycle. And then within each month of that 6-month block is a mesocycle. And then the microcycle could be a week within each month-long block within each mesocycle. So you have multiple microcycles per mesocycle and multiple mesocycles per macrocycle. That can get confusing, but if you plot this all out on paper, it's really not so confusing. The confusing thing about training is that it's so simple, and in its simplicity, it becomes complex. And so if you plot this all on paper, then it's not so confusing. It becomes more simple. Does that make sense? Yes or yes? I hope that makes sense. And so look at the 6-month block, or even the whole year of training, if you can think in that large of a term. And then from the date of the most important race, let's work backwards. And so for shorter races, there's a lot of intense training that happens in the weeks prior to the race. Low volume, high intense training. For something like a marathon and even a half marathon, there's going to be a significantly more volume because it's such an endurance dependent race. For the shorter races, for 800 meters, mile, 5K, it's not as endurance dependent. And so you have a lot more intense training in the weeks preceding the race. But for the longer races, you're going to spend a lot more time on the marathon-specific endurance training. So you may do long tempo runs. You may still keep the mileage up all the way up until you back off right before the race to lose the fatigue. And so the way you set the building, you can think of the macrocycle, the mesocycle, and the microcycle as the building blocks to put the house together. That the macrocycle is the whole house. Then the mesocycles are the rooms in each house. And then the microcycles are the furniture in each room. That's a great way you can think of it. I use that analogy in my next book. So that's the great way to think of it that way. You want to build the whole house. You don't start by just, okay, let's get busy building the whole house. That's too big to think of. You got to break the house down into the rooms, into the mesocycles, and then break each room into the significant pieces that go into each room. The furniture, the walls, the flooring, each thing that goes in each room of the house. And those are the microcycles, is the furniture, the actual pieces that go in each room of the house. So let's work from going backwards. If you're training for, say, a mile or 800 meters, then in the weeks preceding the goal race, you're going to be doing a lot of anaerobic capacity work, speed endurance. So workouts like 400-meter reps, 200-meter reps, 300-meter reps, with a lot of recovery in between each. You do a lot of speed and speed endurance in the weeks before. So a classic example of a miler's workout would be 400-meter reps at mile race pace with enough recovery that you can repeat that intensity. So say you run 400-meter reps in 80 seconds, then you might take 80 to 160 seconds, 1 to 2 work to rest ratio. You may take equal the amount or even more than equal the amount of recovery per rep. So maybe you run for 80 seconds and you take 2 minutes of rest. And that would be done at mile race pace. That becomes a hard workout if you do a number of those reps. Then preceding that, in the weeks preceding that, you would do more of the VO2 max work, where you do longer reps with shorter recovery, so a 1-to-1 or even less than 1 work to rest ratio. So say you do 3-minute reps and you take 2 to 3 minutes recovery to do the VO2 max workouts. Then prior to that, you would do the threshold workouts. And then prior to that, you do the aerobic, just the easy running and maybe longer tempo runs. And so you have to build this with the end in mind and think about, what do I need to do a few weeks prior, and what do I need to do 4 to 6 weeks prior to the race? What do I need to do 12 weeks prior to the race? What do I need to do 20 weeks prior to the race? Because interestingly enough, I was having an interesting talk with one of the runners I coached earlier today, and she said that she wanted to do a tempo run today. She's running a 5K on Sunday, and she wants to do a tempo run today, she said, because she has the 5K run. She thinks it would help her for the 5K run on Sunday. And that's actually not the way it works. So when you think about, when you race, any race that you do is affected by the work that you do in the months before and the few weeks before, because it takes time to adapt to any given workout. You don't do a workout today and proliferate all the physiological adaptations within the next few days. It doesn't work like that. So when you run a race, you're not running that race on the work you did the week of the race. If only it could work that simply. It's much more complicated than that. But in its complexity, it becomes simple. When you know that it takes time to adapt to the workouts, then that can plot your training. Like, we know that it takes longer to adapt to the aerobic work. And so that's one of the reasons why the aerobic work precedes the anaerobic work, because you need more time. It's all protein synthesis. You make more mitochondria to build a greater capillary network, all that stuff. It's all protein synthesis. And that doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to create those extra capillaries, to create the mitochondria, to create the enzymes inside the mitochondria. It's all protein synthesis. and that takes a while to proliferate, to build. Think about when there's a construction project in your neighborhood. It takes a long time. You don't put the scaffolding up, and within 2 days, you got a new building. It takes time to build new buildings. It takes time to repair old buildings. It takes time to do that. And so it's the same thing. You can think of protein synthesis as erecting the scaffolding, and then the workers, the enzymes, go to work on the building. That takes time. And so the work that you do this week does not affect your race on Saturday. You can do more harm than good, though, because the fatigue, you need to drop the fatigue in order to race well. So you can do too much. There's a lot that you can do to hurt your performance the week of the race, but there's not a whole lot you can do to help your performance, because to get faster, that happened in the weeks and months prior to that race. So that's why you got to plan the training and with the end in mind, knowing that, well, what is the most quickest type of workout for you to adapt to and for you to recover from as well, and what work takes you longer to recover from, what work takes you longer to adapt to, and that's how you sequence the training variables. So that is a very brief introduction on how to plan the training. Always start with the end in mind, start with the bigger picture, and then break it down to smaller and smaller segments. And so when you get down from the macro cycle to the meso cycle, which could be 4 to 6 to 8 weeks long, somewhere in that, then you have one purpose. What is the purpose of this meso cycle, this block of training? What am I trying to accomplish? Don't try to throw a million different kinds of workouts at yourself during that period of time. It's much better to have one, possibly two things that you're focusing on. But when you throw too many stimuli at your body, then it's hard to adapt to all those things at once. It's hard to adapt to endurance and speed and technical work all at the same time. Don't try to focus on technique and aerobic endurance and anaerobic speed. Don't try to do all that at once. It's too many different stimuli that your body's trying to adapt to all at once. It's much better to isolate things and really focus on one physiological factor at a time. And then when you get to the next successive phase of training, you use stimulating loads of training for the new factor that you're trying to train, and you use maintenance loads for the factor that you just worked on in the cycle before, because you don't want to completely forget what you did in the cycle before, because you don't want to become detrained in that physiological factor. And so you have to bring things along with you. So say in one phase you're working on VO2 max and you focus on VO2 max workouts. Then the next phase you're moving to anaerobic capacity. You don't want to just drop the VO2 max work that you did earlier, because then you'll become detrained in that fitness factor. So even though you're focused on anaerobic capacity now, every once in a while you use a maintenance type of a workout to have your body, quote, remember what it did in the cycle before. And so you would give maybe once every other week or however long your microcycles are, maybe once during the microcycle or once every other microcycle, you just give yourself a maintenance workout just to remind your body what it was working on before as a maintenance load. So we have stimulating loads that really go hard to try to stimulate change. Then we do more of those kinds of workouts, more per week, more per month, and that's how you organize it. But then you also have maintenance loads, which is not as much of a stimulus. It's not as hard of a stimulus. It's just enough of a stimulus to have your body remember what it used to do in the cycle that preceded it. And that's how you march forward. You think backwards, but that's how you would march forward with the training, is as you move from one cycle, one phase of training to the next phase, you focus on one thing that you want to accomplish. You habituate to that stress. I've talked about habituation versus confusion before. And so you habituate to that stress. You keep hammering with that stress until your body has fully adapted and realized all of its physiological factors that it's going to make, all the protein synthesis. You realize all of that. Your body realizes all of that. And then you include a maintenance load so that you maintain what has been worked on before. And so the manipulation of stimulating loads and maintenance loads is a very elegant way to be able to stimulate one physiological factor while you maintain another. Or to stimulate, you can think of it as stimulating speed while you're maintaining endurance. That's another way to do it. But you don't want to get too crazy with that, because, again, this gets back into habituation versus confusion. You don't want confusion there because that's too much stimuli for your body to adapt to. So the main goal is habituation. You keep hammering that stress until your body has fully realized its potential with that type of workout, and you master the training. That's the other way you can think of it. Keep hammering with that workout or series of workouts until you master the training, but then you also use a maintenance load kind of in the background as a reminder of the work that you did prior. So hopefully that makes sense. And so that's how you would plan the training out. And then as you work on that, it takes time. It's not something that happens in a day. It takes time to think in the macro level and then break it down into smaller and smaller segments where the workout that you do on Tuesday or Thursday is the last thing that you decide on. And that decision ends up becoming obvious once you have planned out the whole structure. Once you plan out the macro cycle, the big overall picture, what is the big aim, what is the purpose I'm trying to serve here, and then you break that down into smaller segments, the mesocycles, with having one focus, one major focus for each mesocycle. Then when you have the focus of each mesocycle, then how you fill in the days of each microcycle, the days of the week, that decision becomes a lot more obvious because now you have the principle, you have the purpose that is guiding your decisions on what workouts to put in there. And then you don't have to ever ask yourself, well, I wonder what workout I should do today. Because that decision is directed by the overall structure, by the purpose of each phase of training. When you know what the purpose is of each phase of training, then the decisions of what to place on each day become obvious. And so that's how you would go through and design the training plan. So I hope that makes sense. That's a very high-level look at what to do. Then you have to get into the weeds. Then you look at each microcycle and you say, okay, well, what's Monday going to look like? What's Tuesday going to look like? Where am I going to place the individual workouts? How much recovery time do I need? Do I do just one workout a week? The way I usually structure the training is I introduce a stimulus, and I probably just do it once a week. And then after I've adapted to that and habituate to that, then I add a second stimulus a week of the same kind of a stimulus. It may not be the exact same workout because there's many ways to do a workout to get the same result. There's many ways to focus on aerobic metabolism. There's multiple ways to focus on anaerobic performance, anaerobic metabolism. So it doesn't have to be the exact same workout. But I'll start with one workout. Let's just call it an A stimulus. Okay, we'll start with 1A. Then we do that for a few weeks. Then the next cycle, I'll put in a second A. So it's a second stimulus of the same type. Maybe a different kind of a workout, but it's the second. Like maybe if you want to train threshold, maybe one workout is a straight up tempo run, continuous tempo run, but the other workout is threshold intervals. Done at the same pace, same purpose, but we're just doing the workout a different way. And that's fine. You want to do that. You want to add some variety. You don't want the workout to be the same every single time, but you want the purpose to remain the same in each phase of training. So I go from 1A stimulus to 2A stimuli. Then after I adapt to that, then the next phase of training, they would take out 1A and put in a B stimulus. So now I have a secondary purpose where maybe once every other week I'm putting in a B stimulus, a different kind of a stimulus, a different kind of a workout. And then over time, after you've habituated to that, you take out the other A and you put in another B. And so now I have 2 Bs. And then over time, as you progress to that, you take out a B, you put in a C stimulus. And then you do that for a few weeks, then you take out the B, and you put in a second C. So you see how that pattern goes? I go 1A stimulus, then 2 A's, then take out an A and put in a B. Then over time, then I take out the other A, and then I put in a second B. And then I do 2 B's for a while. Then I take out a B and I put in a C. Then I do that for a while. Then I take out the other B and I put in a second C. Now I've got 2 C's. And that's how you organize the training. But you start backwards from the race so that you don't run out of time. Because you got to make sure if you need to get through A, B, C, D, E, you got to make sure you have time for D and E. And if you start forwards, you may run out of time. Because you don't know at the outset how long it's going to take. And so you start backwards and you give yourself plenty of time. If I need to spend 3 weeks on an E and 4 weeks on C and 5 weeks on I'm going backwards now. I got to do my letters backwards. E, D, C, B, A. You got to figure out how much time you need to fully realize all the potential in each of those different kinds of stimuli. And that's why you got to work backwards. Otherwise, you're going to run out of time. And then the race is here. And, oh, my God, I haven't done this kind of training. I haven't done that kind of training. In order to make sure you get it all in, you got to work backwards from the date of the most important race. And that's how you would organize the training throughout the year. Start with one stimulus, habituate to that stimulus, take that stimulus out, add another stimulus, but put a maintenance in of the stimulus you did before, get used to that, then put in all of the second stimulus, get used to that, take out one workout, put in another workout of a brand new stimulus, and that's how you march along, so that you're always stimulating and maintaining what you did before. Stimulating a new kind of a workout, new stimulus, maintaining what you did before. And then that's how you march along in the entire training plan. So that is a very quick way of explaining how to do the process, and then deciding, well, what do I do when? And remember all along that you can break some rules. You don't have to always do a long run every Saturday or Sunday. There's no golden rule that says a long run has to be done every 7 days. There's no rule that you need Track Tuesday, that every Tuesday throughout the year you should be doing a track workout. There's no rule that says that. There's even no rule that says you have to increase your volume by 10% per week. I don't know where that comes from, probably Runner's World. Don't get your training advice out of Runner's World unless it's an article I wrote. I used to write a fair amount for Runner's World. Haven't done it in a while. Now they're owned by a different publisher, and now they're like elitist. You can't write for Runner's World anymore. So, but don't get your training advice from Runner's World. Think about what it is that you want to accomplish in each workout and each phase of training, and then let that purpose dictate how you fill in the days of the week. You don't always have to do a workout every 7 days. Ask yourself, from your experience, how long it takes you to adapt to each workout. Maybe you space out the workouts. Maybe you do a workout every 4 days or every 5 days. That's up to you, and how you recover and adapt to the training. Because some people need more recovery. As we get older, it takes us longer to recover. I remember when I was back in high school, we did a lot of intensity all the time, a lot of interval workouts, a lot of races, but you don't think anything of it because you're a teenager and life is good, and you adapt and you recover very quickly. But when you get older, you can't train like that. It takes longer to recover from each workout, and so that's okay. You just need to space the workouts further apart from one another. So maybe you do a 10-day week, a 10-day microcycle, where maybe you repeat a workout, every 5 days. Okay, so maybe you do one at the beginning of the 10 days, in the middle, and at the end, every 4 or 5 days, maybe you repeat the stimulus, and the other days you go easy. So there's many ways to do this, but there's a best way for each individual, and that's what you have to figure out is through experience. What is the best way for you to do it? How often do you do a hard workout? What do those hard workouts look like? Which workouts does it take you longer to recover from? Does it take you longer to recover from an interval workout? Does it take you longer to recover from a long run? Does it take you longer to recover from a hard tempo run? And that's going to dictate each of those phases where you have each of those kinds of focus. Then how, maybe your aerobic endurance phase, you space out the workouts further apart than when you're in your speed endurance phase. Maybe those workouts you can do more often because you don't take as long to recover from those workouts. And so not every phase of training has to be the same duration. That again is up to you and your experience as a runner. But first you have to think on a macro level and then break it down into smaller segments, just as if you were going to build a house. You have the picture of the whole house, and then you compartmentalize it into different rooms, and then you figure out what are the structures that have to go, the furniture that has to go in each room, and that's how you put the whole house together. And you can think of each room of the house is the Meso Cycle. It has a theme. Each room of the house has a theme. This is my bedroom. The bedroom has a theme. This is the kitchen. The kitchen has a theme. The living room has a theme. They don't all look exactly the same. That would make for a boring house, and it wouldn't work. Who would want to come to a house like that? You have to have each house have a separate theme, and that's how you put the training together. And then the furniture that you put in each room, the decision is made by the theme of that room. You know what furniture to put in the room because you have a theme to that room. And so the decisions are made by the purpose of each phase of training, as to what you do on the different days of the week. Okay, that was a lot to ingest, but I just wanted to give a brief summary of how to design the training plan so that you don't get overwhelmed and you think of, well, what do I need to do? What everybody wants to do. No, what should I do on Tuesday? Well, what you do on Tuesday is the last thing that is decided, and it is only decided after you put the entire structure of the plan together. And how do you know that when you do all this? How do you know it's going to work? Because you've worked it. You know it's going to work because you've worked it. And that gets me into my final thought of the episode. Each episode I finish with a final thought. And my final thought today is to work on your training, not just in your training. We get so caught up, runners get so caught up in the minutiae of running. How many miles am I going to run today? What is my heart rate going to be? What exactly does the workout look like? What am I going to do for the workout? Am I going to do a tempo run? Am I going to do intervals? We get so caught up in the actual details of the training. We work in the training. We focus on what we need to do today. How much running should I do today? It's better to start off with working on the training, not just in the training. And this is a life lesson. You can think of this for business also. Work on the business rather than just in the business. Work on your life, not just in your life. That's one of the things I love about running. It transfers over to everything else in your life. And so you have to work on the training. What is the structure? What is the plan of training going to look like? Sit down with a piece of paper or on your computer and actually plot it out. Plot it out like a graph. Make a nice graph with, make a chart and, look at, well, what is this time of the year going to look like? What am I going to do this time? Actually, you can design it any way you want. You can be a little bit of an artist. You can design it any way you want. But you got to plan it out. You got to work on the training, not just in the training. And when you work on the training, it's going to work because you worked on it. You have a plan that's going to work because you apply the science to the plan, to the structure, just like when someone builds a house. They know the house is going to stand up because they have planned it to stand up. They know the materials that they're going to use, and they have a blueprint. Architect has a blueprint. Think of working on your training. You're the architect. The coach is an architect. A runner should be an architect. If you're self-coached, you're an architect first. You create the plan, the blueprint of what the training is going to look like, and then you work on that over and over and over again until it works. And that's how you know it's going to work, because you worked it and you know it works. There's no guessing game. And then you just follow through with the blueprint of the plan. And you do that for the rest of your life too, not just for the training that you do, which is a big part of your life. Running is a big part of our lives, but we also work on it for the rest of our lives. And that's where, I got to take my own advice sometimes and work on the rest of my life the way I work on running. That's a lesson for us all to actually work on our lives, not just in our lives. Work on your training, not just in your training. So that's my thought for the day. Work on your training in addition to working in your training. Work on your life just in addition to working in your life. And that's how you'll know it'll work. Then you create a life that works because you worked it. And then everyone else is going to know what your system is, what's your blueprint. How do you have a successful race? How do you have a successful life? Oh, I can show you how, because I worked on the plan and it worked. And I know it works because it worked. See, this is very complicated stuff I'm talking about here. Thank you very much for joining us for another episode of Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. We will see you next week.